The Center for Leadership and American Principles at Jacksonville State University presents the Tocqueville Lecture Series.
In this installment of the Tocqueville Lecture Series, we engage with Dr. Matthew Brogdon of Utah Valley University and Dr. Catherine Kuiper of Hillsdale College to explore if state governments have the ability to legislate the display of the Ten Commandments in public schools.
The Tocqueville Lecture Series is made possible through grant funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the U.S. Department of Education, and the Jack Miller Center.
Today, we invite two scholars to engage in public discourse with us about the Ten Commandments in public schools. Dr. Matthew Brogdon is the Senior Director of the Center for Constitutional Studies at Utah Valley University. He leads this nonpartisan academic institute, which works to make the tradition of constitutional statecraft accessible to students, teachers, jurists, and scholars through academic programs at Utah Valley University, public events, research, and K-12 teacher professional development programs. Dr. Brogdon has taught and published extensively in the areas of American political thought and constitutional development. His scholarship encompasses the creation and development of the federal courts, judicial federalism, and the development of religious liberty in the colonial constitutions, the politics of nullification and secession, and the critical importance of the corporate form in the Constitution of civil liberties. Please welcome to the stage Dr. Brogdon.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you to Jacksonville State for hosting this event. It is of tremendous value when our institutions of higher education direct themselves to the questions that concern the people of our states and our communities. It's especially important whenever we do that we represent well the concerns and the priorities of the communities from which our universities benefit and into which our students go to in turn benefit them. And programs like the Tocqueville Forum and the programs like I run at Utah Valley are an effort to do that better, to address ourselves to questions and undertake scholarship and teaching that our communities recognize as important and representative of their priorities. So I'm delighted to be here in Alabama. I am a Southern kid. I live in Utah now, but I hail originally from the Florida Panhandle, so this is familiar territory. I enjoyed driving the rental car from Atlanta through all those Alabama pines. Get here yesterday. It is a charming and beautiful place, and I'm very happy to be here and grateful to Ben for hosting me. Does the Constitution forbid state governments and other local entities from displaying the Ten Commandments in public schools? That's a constitutional question. And I'll note at the outset that answering the constitutional question does not necessarily answer the prudential question. A thing might be constitutionally permissible and still be a bad idea or unacceptable to a community or poorly crafted policy. So I'm going to address myself primarily to the question of, does the Constitution forbid displaying the Ten Commandments in public schools? And the short answer up front is, I don't think so. And I think the direction that the Supreme Court has been going will arrive at that conclusion. But why is very important. So this building, this is the eastern pediment of the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court was not built at our founding. The Supreme Court did not have its own home until the 1930s. So this building was constructed in the midst of the Great Depression, which was very controversial, by the way, because it was not a cheap building. But they did have the good sense to employ some very remarkable artists and architects constructing the building. On the eastern pediment, in the center, is Moses, the lawgiver holding stone tablets. And of course, no one can be at a loss for what the stone tablets are. Flanking him, though, on his right is Confucius, and on his left, Solon. Most people probably know who Confucius is. Solon was the writer and statesman, I should say the statesman who wrote Athens' Constitution, Athens' Republican Constitution. It's regarded as one of the great lawgivers in our history and constitution writers. So when it comes to it representing to the public what law is and what its function is, we rely on a tradition. We don't make our laws in a vacuum, and we don't undertake self-government from scratch all the time. We've inherited a tradition. And there's no doubt from our public art, which has marked our public buildings from the beginning, that the religious traditions that inform American constitutionalism and democracy are an important part of those streams that converge to produce the constitutional tradition we've inherited. I actually want to stop on that word for a minute. We celebrate 250 years of the American Republic this year, since the writing and publication of the Declaration of Independence. And it's important how we talk about that. And the way I like to talk about it is as an inheritance. When you inherit a thing, you didn't make it, and you don't have complete freedom to just remake it. You can destroy it and squander it. Those are a couple of things you can do with an inheritance. But an inheritance is also interesting because it rarely does well when it's just left to sit. It has to be cultivated, maintained, built, and even improved. So I like the idea that our founding gives us a constitutional inheritance that we are charged with preserving and conveying to the next generation, but also improving. So I'm going to talk a lot about what the people who wrote our Constitution were thinking and trying to achieve and what they were grappling with, because that informs the way we enforce that Constitution, but it is also incumbent on us to figure out how to live well under it. So let's look at the First Amendment for a moment. The First Amendment is a complex provision. It seems straightforward at the first. It lays out a few rights which are important. If you ask students or members of the public to name some First Amendment rights, they can usually get through 2 or 3 at least. Some folks can name as many as 5. But there are quite a few distinct provisions, and the first 2 that appear in the First Amendment include these 2 religion clauses. And I've separated them out here because I think it is helpful to think about them separately to some extent, though they work together in an important way. What we normally call the Establishment Clause says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And I want to dwell on a few words there. One is, of course, that Congress is the object of this. It does not say, like, for example, the 13th Amendment says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist in the United States or in any place subject to their jurisdiction. It forbids the thing everywhere the American flag flies by any level of government. That's not the kind of provision we're dealing with in the First Amendment. It identifies an institution from which we apparently fear something. There's a concern that were Congress not limited in this way, they might do a thing that the framers of this amendment believe to be harmful. So Congress is told they cannot make laws respecting an establishment of religion. And that's a little different because subsequent rights in the First Amendment, free exercise, we're told Congress can't prohibit the free exercise of religion. And they can't abridge the freedoms of speech or press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble. Let's speak of abridgment and prohibition. Here with the Establishment Clause, we have a ban on Congress making any law respecting, having to do with an establishment of religion. A peculiar term, too, an establishment of religion. We'll talk about what this might mean in a moment, but it certainly seems to suggest that there may be existing establishments of religion Congress can't make laws respecting. Those that existed in states, for example. The American Union was complex already in terms of religion by the time the First Amendment was written. Just to cast you back for a moment, the Constitution had been written in 1787 and ratified in 1788. The first Congress met in 1789, and one of their first tasks was to write a set of amendments to satisfy critics of the Constitution, the people we often call anti-federalists. Those amendments at that time were being made in an environment where American people were a deeply religious people, but also a people with deep differences based on religion. And those people were not evenly distributed throughout the United States. Georgia and Virginia looked nothing like Connecticut and New Hampshire when it came to matters of religious faith. They did contain large Christian majorities of some sect, but those Christian sects had important internal differences. It's obvious that people from Massachusetts did not want Southerners making rules about religion to govern them. So there's a deep-seated concern with a central authority sticking its nose into local religious affairs that drives this language. It's also the case that internally many of the states were diverse religiously. They had religious minorities in them, and in some cases had deep shifts. The First Great Awakening had happened over a course of years prior to the framing of our Constitution, and the fruit of that had been that many colonies where there had been very clear and coherent religious civil societies like Congregationalism in Massachusetts, for example, became fractured by evangelical sects, Baptists, and evangelical Methodists who were winning adherents, a slowly growing Catholic population, a small but significant community of Jews in some American communities. There had always been Quakers in American communities. Dealing with those instances of religious diversity meant that states had to come up with carefully crafted accommodations for how their laws that could easily impinge on religious conscience could be adapted to deal with the potential conflicts that arose, to both represent the community's piety, its religious character, and at the same time avoid conflict and avoid the violation of conscience. Many states combined at this time what we might call benign religious establishments or even pluralistic religious establishments that provided all sorts of state support to religion and all sorts of expressions of religion in civil society at the same time that they scrupulously avoided violating the consciences of religious dissenters in the state. Those two things did coexist in many instances. In fact, it would not be until the 1830s that really the last of the states would shed what we would clearly call a religious establishment. This is quite a long process. 50 years from the founding it took before Americans really settled on what the mode of disestablished religion looked like among a religious people. Okay, so that's one note on the Establishment Clause. So the folks framing this are concerned not only with ensuring that Congress won't establish its own religion. Nobody wanted a national church. You want consensus? It was that. Nobody wanted a national church. That was clear. But secondary to that, and you can see this in the debates over the amendment, was the concern that you also didn't want Congress disrupting the carefully negotiated settlements that existed on these matters in the states. So the Establishment Clause really ought to be thought of more like a delegation of authority on this. Congress doesn't make laws on this subject, the states do. Free exercise clause is a bit different. It launches into rights or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, the free exercise of religion. This is something government's not supposed to interfere with or fiddle with. You have a private activity of some kind that government's supposed to keep its hands out of. Now, what about states? We talked about Congress. What about the states? Well, the 14th Amendment after the Civil War launched a largely new project of extending federal constitutional protections to the people of the states, so that people in the states receive protection from their state, or I should say against their state, from the federal authority. And the operative language here in the 14th Amendment, that no state shall, notice the corollary, by the way, Congress shall make no law, and no state shall, sound very similar and a parallel. So here we have no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. So I'll just note at the outset that at least one way to read this situation is that the 14th Amendment ensures that states can't violate the rights and liberties of their citizens insofar as they're protected by the U.S. Constitution. Things like free exercise of religion and speech and press, and the right against search and seizure, and other important liberties that individuals enjoy. That would not necessarily apply this Establishment Clause. The Establishment Clause was not an individual liberty. It was an institutional delegation. It said, states shall do this, the federal government shall not. And so it's quite possible, quite plausible, to interpret the First Amendment in such a way that we need to carefully protect people from violations of their religious conscience or free exercise of religion by their state, but that there's no broad Establishment Clause limitation on the states. This is at least one available way to read the amendment. It's one that, for example, Akhil Amar at Yale Law School has argued for decades. It was once a voice in the wilderness on this. And more recently, Don Drakeman, in his book on the Establishment Clause, which is going on 12 or 13 years old now, have taken this position. So let's talk about for a moment, though. Let's imagine for a minute that I'm wrong on this and that the Establishment Clause does apply to the states. Or even, let's imagine Congress makes a law. The federal government does run a school system in the Department of Defense, for example. What if Congress made a law requiring the display of the Ten Commandments in DoD schools, right? What would happen? Would those count as an establishment of religion? Well, I'll mention quickly, the Supreme Court has recently discarded a number of tests that have been used in the past to defeat state efforts to display the Ten Commandments and engage in other acts of what I would call public piety, civil religion. Those would include, for example, Justice O'Connor's test, which prevailed for some time. She persuaded many of her colleagues that the Establishment Clause contained an endorsement test. Government could not be seen to endorse religious opinions or religious traditions. They could give public expression to them as long as the particular expression didn't imply that the government was approving of or endorsing them. That didn't fit particularly well with our historical practice or the practice of the early Congresses under the Constitution. What was called the Lemon test, which was a three-part test I won't go into too deeply, had two prongs in particular that the court liked to use. One, the idea that any use of federal or state funds or any seeming religious activity had to, at bottom, have a secular purpose. If it appeared that the purpose of the state was religious and not secular in character, regardless of what the action itself was, that motive would defeat it or qualify it as a religious establishment. And also the idea of entanglement, that if in fact some policy entangled religion with the state, that we had a constitutional problem. The court in just the last couple of years, a case called Kennedy versus Bremerton, which involved a football coach praying at midfield in a very conspicuous way. The court, in an opinion written by Justice Gorsuch, discarded emphatically the Lemon test, as well as, the court said, its progeny. Now, importantly, the Lemon test progeny included a case called Stone versus Graham, where the Supreme Court back in the 80s had invalidated a Kentucky law that required the posting of the Ten Commandments in classrooms on the basis of this secular purpose requirement. They decided that the rhetoric surrounding the adoption of the law contained too much in the way of religious motives, and that the states, in their words, pretended historical and civil motives were overwhelmed by its religious purpose. And so the court had struck that down in a divided opinion that's had some questionable authority subsequently. But Stone versus Graham, when it declared these kinds of laws unconstitutional, was operating on the basis of the Lemon test. And the Lemon test has been discarded by the court. So cases coming out of, for example, Louisiana and Texas, which made their way to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals on Tuesday this week. In the oral arguments in those cases, one of the things that the court had to deal with was whether Stone versus Graham was even binding precedent. And it seemed, my impression, or at least the reporting on the Fifth Circuit's deliberations, seems to suggest the court doesn't feel particularly bound by Stone v. Graham, because the Supreme Court has discarded the Lemon test. So what's left? What do we do then? If it's not about endorsements or secular purpose or entanglement, just what do we look to? The court in Kennedy versus Bremerton suggested we should look to our historical practices, and especially as they cast light on original meaning, is what this might have meant at the time the language of the First Amendment was written. Now, as I've already suggested, that's going to raise a really important question for us. Because I'd say, when we look at the founding, there is a kind of founding consensus that we can find. And it really just consists of those two things we already talked about. No national church, and keeping Congress out of the state's business when it came to religion. But that's not a very robust meaning. And in fact, many Americans at the time the First Amendment was written attached far more to the concept of a religious establishment. Justice Gorsuch, for example, himself, in Kennedy versus Bremerton, or not Kennedy, but a separate case, Shurtleff, outlined at least six, I think I jotted these down, at least six things that might indicate or might have been treated by the founding generation as an establishment of religion. He said these would include things like government control of doctrine and personnel of the churches. So if the government's deciding who your pastor is and what your church teaches, that sounds like an establishment. Mandatory attendance at religious services. Compulsory financial support in the form of tithes. It's not just money out of the state budget, but the government telling you you have to give money to your church to support it. Restrictions on dissenting worship, trying to suppress other religious worship. Religious tests for participation in politics or the holding of public office, or the use of churches for civic functions. Having your church do civil record keeping, ceremonies, or even policing. So those were some of the things that Gorsuch hunted up. And there were many people who did think those were essential parts of an establishment. On the other hand, some folks in the founding generation didn't find these things as problematic or think they necessarily constituted establishments of religion when taken by themselves. There's a little bit of disagreement and uncertainty here about just what the original meaning of establishment is. Certainly, if we fast forward and we take in a longer history, we might get a better picture. Right? We expand the view. And in fact, Nathan Chapman and Michael McConnell in a recent book called Agreeing to Disagree about the Establishment Clause suggest just this kind of meaning. They say if we look at the 50 years after the founding, we actually find Americans did settle on what this establishment of religion looks like. It just took them a few decades. But that's getting well outside the founding, so I'm not sure how the court will treat it. There's also the fact that the first Congress and other founding era deliberative bodies engaged in some quite openly religious conduct. Civil religion seemed to be pretty vibrant. I don't know how well you can see that scene in the middle. The seal you see in the middle of that is a seal that Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson worked up on a committee in the Continental Congress in 1776. This was their proposed first seal for the United States. It didn't win out. But if you can discern that, that's Moses standing on the bank over there, and the cloud and fire that represents Yahweh presiding over the drowning of Pharaoh's army as the people of Israel flee from Egypt. In other words, the Great Seal, with the slogan, "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God," was proposed as a representation of our nation by Jefferson and Franklin. It didn't make it to fruition. I think it's a useful example. It's not in any way decisive. It is interesting to me that those two in particular, who are often painted as maybe our least, or maybe I should put it this way, our most heterodox founders in matters of religion, perhaps some of the furthest from traditional Christian faith, settled on a miraculous event in the Bible to describe the origins of the American nation. The first Congress urged presidents to issue proclamations, not just of Thanksgiving, which you're familiar with. I don't know if you've ever read Washington's Thanksgiving Proclamation. It's a shockingly pious and religious document by modern standards. I don't think anybody said God that much since Bill Clinton. Hypocrisy is also an American thing. But also proclamations of days of fasting and repentance. John Adams, as president, issued a proclamation that referred not only to God Almighty in a generic monotheistic sense, but also to the Holy Spirit and the redeeming work of the Son. The first Congress hired chaplains for itself and even paid and funded missionaries for Western territories, missionaries to educate Native Americans in the Christian religion. However fraught that might be in terms of its effect, the fact is Congress thought itself free to pursue religious purposes even without establishing a church or trying to control those churches that existed. So I think there's some considerable distance between what the consensus of the founding generation was about what constituted an establishment of religion and what we typically think it is now. So I think the really important question, and this will play very importantly in cases that involve schools, is do religious displays prohibit free exercise of religion? Even if symbolic, passive displays, expressions of piety by the government, aren't establishments of religion by themselves, do they coerce anyone in a way that would prohibit the free exercise of religion, that is, violate the Free Exercise Clause? This, unlike the Establishment Clause, almost certainly does apply to states through the 14th Amendment, I think. Does it compel any religious practice or belief? Well, one could imagine a situation where you not only posted the Ten Commandments in what we would call a passive display, but required some sort of recitation of them, some outward sign or expression of affirmation of them, could potentially be construed as coerced belief, especially in a school. Does it forbid religious practice or belief? I think this is probably the tallest order. Presuming it's a passive display, it is difficult to imagine a realistic set of circumstances where some citizen is forbidden from practicing their religion by the fact that the government has expressed its own religious views. And finally, and probably the most fraught question, are school children a special case here? Even if we accept this in legislative prayers and courthouse grounds and things of that kind, what about the classroom? Aren't children particularly impressionable? After all, the court in Lee versus Weissman back in the 90s, in a case by Justice Kennedy, described a psychological coercion that the student experiences when they are audience to, not participating in, but audience to the state's expression. There it was a rabbi praying at a graduation ceremony. And the court's concern was that the fact that a rabbi had been invited to pray may convey to a child in the audience that they're an outsider, or it may pressure them to conform in their opinions or show some outward affirmation of what the rabbi's saying. Most of us would just call that peer pressure. Justice Scalia wrote a dissent in that case, which made some very interesting points. One of which was that in a diverse society, we find ourselves continually in the company of people who don't share our convictions or our religious tradition. And we quite often, perhaps at the dinner table, perhaps in other professional settings, private settings, commemorations, weddings, funerals, we find ourselves in the company of people who are exercising their own religious faith in various ways, and we're audience to them even while not sharing them. And it is quite possible to politely be audience to someone else's religious exercise without being expected to affirm it yourself. It's also not reasonable to expect that the only way people can distance themselves from religious expressions they disagree with are to get up and leave the room or plug their ears. If that's the case, polite society is at an end in a diverse society. We all have to live with each other. So, are school children a special case? Possibly. It is possible to imagine that, for example, the state composed a prayer and said it in the mornings and urged children to say it along with them. That seems to me a marginal case in terms of putting pressure on the child to affirm it. Is posting a written document on the wall with which the child and their parents may disagree constitute a coercion? I don't think so. Being audience to speech with which you disagree does not constitute coercion. Being forced to affirm it in some way does. So I think we can draw at least some lines there. There's Governor Abbott in Texas, pointing to the monument that he managed to successfully defend about 20 years ago, whenever I guess he was the state solicitor general or something of that kind, where the court did uphold some of these. The court has come down on both sides of this. I think Catherine's going to talk a little bit about this. So I won't bore you with it, but I'll let her tell the story. But the court has, waffled on this. And some of the question for them has been, are these monuments simply standing as an expression of the government's religious opinions, or do they serve other purposes? Do they stand with other things that communicate, other documents, other symbols? There's the old joke about the 2 reindeer rule. You can have a nativity scene on the courthouse lawn as long as there's at least 2 reindeer, a Santa Claus, and a menorah. Just as long as nobody thinks the government's actually expressing any genuine enthusiasm. In other words, we'll only accept hypocrisy out of the government, not any kind of genuine expression of piety that the community agrees with. I also want to say, because this is the Tocqueville Lecture Series, I take very seriously, and I think we should take seriously, one of Tocqueville's warnings. He actually said that one of the things America had done was united the spirit of freedom and the spirit of religion. What he meant by that was, Americans managed to be a free country that believed in broad individual freedom, not government coercion, and at the same time to remain a devout people. When Europeans did that, they tended to cast off religious authority along with political authority. And Americans succeeded at doing both, and that was a remarkable thing. And Tocqueville attributed that in part to the fact that American churches did not exercise political authority. American clergymen were not politicians. Said, and that was very important because it made them more powerful and influential in our society because of the fact that they were not corrupted by participation in politics and they weren't associated with political parties. So I do want to take seriously, as a devout American, I want to take seriously that for those of us who cherish our faith in America and want to see it be vibrant, we should be careful not to stake our hopes on government support or promotion of religion. So while I think religious displays are fine, they're not establishments of religion, I don't think they're coercive, I think they can have some serious downsides in terms of the actual authority of religion in the lives of Americans. So if your concern is with saving souls, betting on the government to do it for you is a bad bet. I'll leave it there.
Dr. Catherine Kuiper is an assistant professor of education at Hillsdale College, which is a major source of teachers for schools that embrace a classical education. She teaches philosophy of education and specializes in interdisciplinary seminars in theology, philosophy, and literature. In addition, she teaches courses in logic, grammar, rhetoric, and other fundamental parts of a classical education. Her research focuses on educational philosophy and the practice of the early Jesuit order across the world, especially in the role of the arts in the Jesuit colleges. She earned her PhD in political science from the University of Notre Dame in 2018, where she wrote a dissertation on Suarez and John Locke's theories of natural law and political community. Please join me in welcoming her to the stage.
I'm excited to be here in Alabama. This is my first time visiting down here. And I'm very grateful to Ben for his hospitality and his kindness during this visit. This has been a very good experience. Okay. So in 2024, the governor of Louisiana, Jeff Landry, signed into law a bill that requires the display of the Ten Commandments in public school classrooms. I'll put some of the text of the law up here so we can look at that. The law indicates that there must also be included a 4-paragraph context statement that says, among other things, that the Ten Commandments were a prominent part of American public education for almost 3 centuries. Schools may also display the Mayflower Compact, the Declaration of Independence, and the Northwest Ordinance, although they are not obliged to do so. Only the Ten Commandments are required. Explaining the purpose of the law, Landry said, quote, "If we want to respect the rule of law, we've got to start from the original lawgiver, and that's Moses." End quote. Texas passed a version of this law in 2025. Alabama's legislature is in the process of working through similar legislation now in 2026. The Louisiana and Texas legislation is currently working through the courts, and expectations at this point are that the suits will make their way to the Supreme Court. And this, in fact, seems to have been part of Louisiana governor's hope, as he said to a room full of fundraisers after signing the bill, "I can't wait to be sued." The ACLU, along with other concerned groups, issued a joint statement after the law was passed to claim, quote, "The law violates the separation of church and state," end quote, and is blatantly unconstitutional. And, quote, "The First Amendment promises that we all get to decide for ourselves what religious beliefs, if any, to hold and practice without pressure from the government. Politicians have no business imposing their preferred religious doctrine on students and families in public schools." End quote. Does the Louisiana law violate the First Amendment, specifically the no law respecting an establishment of religion clause? My answer is yes. I think it is a violation under the current mode of interpreting Establishment Clause issues. And I also think this kind of attempt to educate American citizens about religion deserves close attention and careful thought. I am in some sympathy with the ACLU when it comes to the substance of the law, and yet I think the reasoning on display in the ACLU statement is also seriously flawed. Now, is there precedent for this situation? As we've already heard, yes, almost exactly. In 1980, Stone v. Graham, the Supreme Court found that mandatory displays of the Ten Commandments in Kentucky school rooms were in violation of the First Amendment Establishment Clause. And at that time, the Lemon Test, as you've already heard, is what helped them come to that decision. Did the 1980 Kentucky law serve a secular purpose? Well, not according to the majority, who said that posting religious texts on the classroom wall served no educational function. Educational function would be something along the lines of reading the Bible in the context of history, civilization, ethics, comparative religion, or the like, they said. So they felt the position on the wall inclined rather to something like an inculcation of reverence for the document. Now, Justice Rehnquist, in the dissent, found that the displays were indeed serving a suitably secular purpose and connected the display to the students knowing anything at all about religion in their country. That the end of that quote is interesting. He is worried about students being wholly ignorant of the currents of religious thought and thinks that the Ten Commandments on the wall would fix that. Now, the Ten Commandments themselves have caused the Supreme Court some theoretical and interpretive trouble, as Dr. Brogdon was just alluding to. In 2005, 2 cases came before the court regarding displays of the Ten Commandments in courthouses or other government buildings. In McCreary County, the ACLU, the issue was over a display inside a Kentucky courthouse. This was found unconstitutional and taken down. Van Orden v. Perry concerned a large monument outside on the grounds of the Texas Capitol and was found constitutional and left alone. So to review, that's a problem. That's not a problem, okay? Same summer, same group of people working through this. All right. Now, the pair of contradictory rulings to some degree illustrates at least one of the problems we face. The 2 rulings on remarkably similar situations come to different decisions of a 5-4 split. We have to admit, we don't seem to fully understand what role the First Amendment is supposed to be playing in the relationship of government and religion. In the case of the Texas Monument, this big one, now that's not the actual Texas Monument, but that's exactly what it looks like. Justice Breyer could only offer that the monument had, after all, been there for a long time, and it would surely cause more disruption and division to remove it at this point, deciding that the Establishment Clause was largely about preserving the peace and good relations. He found it would best be implemented by just leaving things alone. Now, as for the new law in question today, the Louisiana Attorney General posted some online possible iterations of the display called for by the bill, apparently in an attempt to assuage concerned citizens. In her versions, that you can see here, the Ten Commandments could become a useful point of reference for understanding popular music on the one hand, or an important historical moment on the other. But her options here don't actually adhere to the text of the law, if you recall from the first slide, which require the Ten Commandments to be the central focus of the poster. They can't be next to something else. Reminding students that the Ten Commandments affected our understanding of art and history is not actually what the law is describing. It's something more, like the reverence that was noted in Stone v. Graham, along with historical context that draws the students to remember where else this has happened in American history. So even taking into consideration the required paragraph of historical context required, I remain in my opinion that the Louisiana, Texas, and Alabama laws are violations of the First Amendment. The conflicting messages coming from the court in the summer of 2005 were about displays on general government property. The law in question now is like the law that was struck down in 1980 in Stone v. Graham. Presence of the displays in classrooms indicate a more directive goal than a general awareness of history in government buildings. And for this reason, it's complicated, but I also think that's importantly different than the case of the football coach praying on the field that Dr. Brogdon brought up in committee. Consider Governor Landry's description of the law's purpose. Quote, if we want to respect the rule of law, we've got to start from the original lawgiver, and that's Moses. He connects these displays with the origin of law itself. And so he, at least, expects students to see the Bible as foundational for law itself. Under this law, the Ten Commandments, quoted from the book of Exodus, are mandatory for classroom display. So this is not just possible. It's not just encouraged, it's required. The other listed historical documents, such as the Mayflower Compact or the Northwest Ordinance, are not required. They're simply an option. And this means that the Ten Commandments will be on the wall in a manner that is clearly meant to indicate that whatever other moral, legal, religious traditions may exist, they are not crucial to American education. Only this one is. And this, I think, is a grave mistake. Before I go further into my misgivings about the display of the Ten Commandments in isolation on the walls of the school, as well as my disagreement with the reasoning of the ACLU, I want to acknowledge another key component in this case, which is the matter of incorporation, which Dr. Brogdon has already covered, so just quickly review. The Bill of Rights was added to the U.S. Constitution in part because of fears expressed by the anti-federalist opponents of this kind of national constitution. Thus, the First Amendment protects the states from a federal decision affecting state decisions about matters like religion. There are 19th century court cases that exhibit just this understanding of the First Amendment, that it did not govern state laws, but existed to prevent the federal government from interfering. And so, some scholars who research the original intent, meaning, and application of this amendment find cause to keep it entirely out of a situation like Louisiana's new law. It was common practice in the first 50 years of the Constitution for various states to have established religion. This did not look uniform across the country, and that was the point. The states retained the freedom to make those choices according to their own legislative power. So allowing Louisiana to govern itself in this way is in keeping with the early years of the United States. The reason I'm unpersuaded by this position is because of the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868. Among its provisions we find, as you've already heard, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. This has been interpreted by the court for over 100 years now to mean that the states may retain the power to govern themselves, but not in such a way that they flout the principles laid out in the Bill of Rights. There can and should be variety across the country, but there are limits to that variety. Regarding the First Amendment in its original context is illuminating, and so is reading the 14th Amendment in its context. This amendment is not of the founding era, it's of the Reconstruction era, and it brings with it the hard-earned insights of America's first 80 years. As it turned out, some states were more than varied in their approach to Republican government. They were inconsistent with the aims of popular government as envisioned by the United States Constitution. Thus, the scope of activities left open to the several states narrowed after the Civil War. This is historical, political, and legal fact. This perspective would mean that Louisiana residents should be asking their government whether this law aims to establish one religion over others, or to put forward one religion over others. And I think it does. I think any atheist, Hindu, Muslim, or Buddhist parent would understand that position. But I also maintain, even though this law is, in my opinion, deficient in its formulation, I still think it would be a political good for the Ten Commandments to be present on school walls. And I still maintain that the ACLU was mistaken in its argumentation. So what do I mean by this? The ACLU objected that the Louisiana law violated not just the First Amendment, but the wall of separation that does or should exist between church and state. More broadly, between religion and the government. This phrase, the wall of separation, I'm sure you've all heard, is a reference to a letter of Thomas Jefferson's where he refers to this conceptual wall favorably. Thus, wall of separation provides a historical basis for one possible reading of the clause in question, that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Not only the ACLU, but also many Supreme Court rulings in the second half of the 20th century have noted that their reading of the First Amendment depends on an understanding of a wall of separation between church and state, which has frequently amounted to a version of no contact. The government should never let on that it knows or even suspects the existence of religion in its legislation, sometimes on its property. But the Constitution does not direct us to read the First Amendment in this supposedly Jeffersonian ideal of separation. It appears to me, at least, I'm not a lawyer, but it looks to me like it's there to prevent Congress or state legislatures from singling out one religion to receive such special treatment from the government that citizens might feel an incentive to join up to benefit from that treatment. Not only is the wall of separation reading not a necessary heuristic, I argue that it is in fact politically harmful to a United States citizen. The fact of religious pluralism makes ignorance of religion a political problem. Ignorance of religion, along with assumptions about what counts as real or American religion, are conditions that are liable to generate hostility and conflict. Who gets to be a real American? And here, I've put up a slide that I just want us to look at for a minute. Look at that building. Look at the architectural details, the statues. and to wonder, where would you assume that this is? This looks like the Far East, right? It looks like the Far East. It looks like it's New Jersey. This is in Robbinsville, New Jersey. So this is a pretty new, right? This is a pretty new architectural feature for the place, but this is in America. This is where some of our fellow citizens are going to worship and to receive religious instruction. So it comes back to our question, I think, who gets to be a real American? Who do we regard as sufficiently American? I'm not worried about you anymore. I'm not suspicious about you anymore. What religions do we regard as unacceptable for political office, despite the fact that the Constitution bars the religious test? These questions affect our shared life as members of a great political community. If I have no knowledge of the deep resonances among the major world religions, if I think that my neighbor has a radically different conception of God and morality, then I am less likely to consider that neighbor as a fellow citizen with shared needs, let alone as a possible friend. This is an image of the Islamic Center of America in Dearborn, Michigan, the largest mosque in the United States, in my home state. Ignorance of religion directly affects the social fabric of the entire country, challenging and significantly limiting civic friendship, putting up unnecessary barriers to office for some, and preventing others from successfully sharing their opinions and arguments. Thus, it is my contention that rather than committing to strict separation from all religion, the U.S. government has a vested interest in making more religions more widely known and understood to the American public. And schools are precisely the arena where this formation could be most successfully accomplished. Ignorance of minority religions manifests in distrust and hostility. So the headline that I pulled at random, just doing a few searches, 2 in 5 Americans say Islam is incompatible with U.S. values. What does this mean? What do they have in mind when they say something like this? I'm not sure. Pulled another, this was from a Gallup poll about willingness to vote for president. I think it's noteworthy that for the Republicans, at least, a Catholic, it's probably fine to vote for a Catholic president. Then you look at the gap between that and voting for a Muslim president. It's pretty remarkable. And I don't think this is born out of a deep knowledge of Islamic moral, philosophical, and legal traditions. I think it's born out of fear, a lot of fear. This is also an interesting just graphic from the Pew Research Center on what it takes to be truly American. And there are still a lot of people who would say that being Christian is part of being truly American. So headlines, studies, and polls show that a significant number of Americans have strong reservations, if not outright objections, to, for instance, Muslims as part of our political community. And this manifests in the positions we've seen that question a Muslim's qualification for office, whether Muslims can even have U.S. values, and whether you must be a Christian to be a real American. This is a problem because non-Christians are already here. They are already Americans. We owe it to each other and to the country as a whole to see each other as fellow citizens, co-sufferers of the hardships of life, and co-workers toward the common good. Part of our confusion centers on whether we should call America a Christian nation. Because the majority of Americans at the time of the founding were Christian, and because most Americans up to the present day have been Christian, you will hear this claim made. Not from the government, officially, of course, but from the many Americans who think it should be understood that the country just is Christian. But that would imply that the laws and customs of the land are uniquely Christian, have their origin in Christianity, or depend on Christian ideas for their legitimacy. And certainly this is what Governor Landry intended to communicate in the Louisiana law, the idea that this country respects law because of the original lawgiver, Moses. I think this identification of America as a Christian nation misses the accomplishment of the American founding, which did, yes, depend on the virtues and ideas of a great many Christians, but was designed to be a nation for Christians and other religions as well. And here I want to stick especially with the First Amendment's protection of religious freedom, because some will claim that this is a Christian contribution to the new republic. But that's a complicated story. The Catholics who founded Maryland, yes, established religious toleration. but that act was repealed 5 years after it passed. Rhode Island established religious toleration because Roger Williams was banished from Massachusetts for insisting that even atheists and non-Christians should be tolerated. The repeal of Maryland's toleration and the banishment of Roger Williams both happened for Christian reasons, to preserve the faith, understood differently by different Christian congregations. The history of Europe before and especially after the Reformation is decidedly not one of Christian freedom and toleration, quite the opposite. The U.S. Constitution is the first founding document to commit an entire country to religious freedom as found in the First Amendment. For Christians to decide on this path forward, after the way heresy had been policed and non-Christian populations such as the Jews had been treated, is remarkable. It's a tremendous gift. But this was not how Christian countries had ever organized themselves before. So I don't think it makes sense to describe this element as a Christian distinctive. It's a Christian possibility, certainly, but not a distinctive. Additionally, to call America a Christian nation risks obscuring how variegated the country has always been. From its earliest days as a series of English, Spanish, and French colonies, this country did not share a language or a culture, and it most certainly did not share one faith. Although John Jay famously expressed in Federalist II that it was one connected people who won independence from Great Britain, quote, descended from the same ancestors, end quote, and professing the same religion, those same people would likely not have accepted that description. Many of the Christians who populated the 13 colonies would not have regarded each other as Christian. Many churches in the colonies believed that both Quakers and Catholics were outside the bounds of Christianity entirely. Before the Revolution, it was illegal for Catholic priests to live in New York or Massachusetts. And as for the same ancestors, I think of the many Irish immigrants present at the time of the founding and imagine they would at least have objected to that description. So radically other and alien did some Protestant Christians find the presence of Roman Catholics in the new country that Catholics were often associated with other, even more uncommon religions. During the Constitution's ratification debate in North Carolina, anti-federalist activist William Lancaster criticized the religious neutrality of the Constitution in the following words, quote, "Let us remember that we form a government for millions yet not in existence. In the course of 500 years, I do not know how it will work. This is most certain, that papists may occupy that chair. Mohammedans may take it. I see nothing against it." End quote. The Constitution did nothing to forestall an eventuality as wild as a Catholic or a Muslim taking office. That was reason enough for him to object. But the Constitution was ratified, even in North Carolina, and it remained a possibility for Catholics and Muslims to hold office. And the founding generation contained the range of opinions we might expect of men who were Christian in more or less orthodox ways, and of men who were not Christian at all. John Adams, in his Thoughts on Government, I have here up on the slide, brought forward the witness of Zoroaster and Muhammad when defending the idea that virtue is the source of happiness. Ben Franklin wrote in his autobiography, also on the slide, about the untroubling idea of a Muslim legal scholar coming to expound on Islamic teachings in Philadelphia. Thomas Jefferson recalled in his autobiography the fight that took place in the Virginia legislature over its own religious freedom bill when they considered limiting the protection to those who professed faith in Jesus Christ. Jefferson emphasized the good of not limiting protection to Christians because it meant, quote, the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Mohammedan, the Hindu and infidel of every denomination, end quote, could live in Virginia and take part in its life. The idea of an America rich with various religions was there from the beginning as a reasonable view of a project that was beginning. In smaller numbers, those varieties were there among the Revolutionary era Jews, Catholics, and even Muslims. The possibility of those numbers growing to become significant portions of the Republic is now a fact of life. So, if we don't respond to this fact with mandatory displays of the 10 Commandments in our schools, how ought we to respond? And I think the most compelling alternative to the proposed legislation we are discussing already exists. It can be found in the building where the rulings and cases we've touched on today are decided. We've already seen the Supreme Court building in Dr. Brogdon's slides. This is inside the courtroom. On the north and south walls of the Supreme Court building, 2 reliefs are carved. Each of them displays a procession of lawgivers reaching back to the earliest point in recorded history and proceeding in an array of historical figures from around the world. The Egyptian pharaoh Menes comes first, followed by Hammurabi, Moses, Solomon, Lycurgus, Solon, Draco, Confucius, Octavian, and then on the next wall we find Justinian, Muhammad, Charlemagne, King John, Louis IX, Grotius, Blackstone, John Marshall, and Napoleon. Christians and non-Christians are there, Protestants and Catholics, in an array that does indeed educate the viewer. We see that Moses is not the origin of law as we know it. We see that a universal concern for law, order, virtue obtains when you take the time to search for it. We see that the desire to separate religion and the government cannot hold across the board because from our earliest history, human beings have associated law with divinity, transcendence. Religion cannot be quarantined so easily. Here I'll note that the group at the top, that upper group of figures, every one of those is someone who would consider their law to be based in a religious foundation. Almost every single one of them would have described their law as coming from the gods. This is one of, that really is a grounding fact of the human history of law. So rather than isolate the 10 Commandments from religious history by placing it on a wall by itself, I think a republic would be much better served by showing and honoring the broader history of law, religion, and moral striving as has been done in the Supreme Court building. This more maximal approach could then help students understand and appreciate the place that the 10 Commandments, with other religious and moral traditions, still play in our political achievements. Thank you.
Thank you both. Maybe a great starting point would be this. You both have looked to the founding. You both looked to original intent. And yet you have come to different decisions, different ideas. What do you think draws your different conclusions from looking at these similar sources?
I'm inclined toward something of a minimalism whenever it comes to looking at the founding. I think where the record is slim, where there's deep disagreement among the folks who are writing and ratifying the text, at least when it comes to national uniformity, if the court is going to say it has to be done this way and no other, then I think that needs to be grounded on clear constitutional meaning. And to me, at least with the Establishment Clause, there's not a robust basis for extending clear constitutional meaning there. I do think it's important to point out that, if Catherine and I were both in a legislature trying to debate this, she might persuade me that regardless of whether the plans, the undertakings of Louisiana and Texas and potentially Alabama, while they might be constitutional, her approach, I might conclude that her approach is more wise, is better law. So it is important to disambiguate the constitutional from the policy question there. But yeah, I would hew a little closer whenever we're talking about intruding into such a sensitive space that impacts so many parts of American life, and where states do really grapple with very different situations. I'd like it to be grounded on much clearer constitutional text.
And I think that I could also be persuaded that constitutionally speaking, there might not be enough present in the Establishment Clause to be totally sure what's going on there. I do agree. It's an oddly written phrase and clearly has caused considerable confusion. I'm not firmly settled in my own mind about incorporation on this issue, but for the moment, I'm still thinking about the implications of the 14th Amendment being, refounding sounds like too strong a word, but certainly a moment of revisiting some of these rights and reconsidering the relationship between the federal and the state governments. So I do think that's an important thing to keep in mind, that we don't just go to the founding, but to other moments in our nation's history where some very tense navigation has happened, and take that seriously as well.
You guys bring up a good point too. There's a difference between what's constitutional and what might be prudential. What do you think is the proper relationship between governmental institutions and religion in America? What should that relationship look like?
It should be friendly. It should be a friendly relationship. In my opinion, I think as I stated, I think educationally speaking, at the very least, the government should, I think about all the range of objectives the government might want from its schools. And certainly we want students who are well educated enough in STEM to contribute to our economy and to our inventions and to our technological life. We want students who are well educated enough in the humanities that they understand their country's tradition of letters and understand its history. We want students who are educated in civics well enough to take part in public life. I think what has been neglected is education in religion because it's thorny and difficult and controversial. But I've become more convinced that it's a real public life issue. And I think we see ways in which we're suffering the consequences of the ignorance of religion now.
I think it's a remarkable thing that American states did move from a situation where most states or colonies had coherent religious establishments of some kind. Whenever we get close to the American Revolution, and that over the ensuing 50 years, Americans did not become suddenly secular. This was not an age of secularization. Americans remained a vibrant religious community, but nonetheless, largely abandoned the ambition of realizing or practicing religious faith through law or governing institutions. And that was a policy decision that states made over time, and I think it has something to do with religious diversity. Even though what we now think of as dissenting religions, so we were dealing with competing Christian sects for the most part. I think there was a realization that, and there's an empirical basis for the idea that religion actually prospers from the neglect of government. It's a sort of benign neglect. So even while the Constitution, I think, leaves lots of room for this, I do think it's the case. Just surveying history, I guess if I were to assemble all of the historical regimes that have governed human societies, even since the advent of Christianity, there aren't very many I'd want to put in charge of my church. And so that does counsel some caution on that. But I do think a vibrant religious people is going to find some expression for those things in their community. I like Catherine's description of this, that there's an openness to talking about religion in our public institutions. And I do think one other place is accommodating the open exercise of religion by public servants. This is something we didn't get into, but can prove controversial. American politicians have a very long history of being devout in public, giving expression to their religious sentiments, especially whenever they can do so in a way that signals their faithfulness to their tradition without alienating their constituents, right? I mean, there's a delicate balance there. But there are regimes who have tried to settle this in the other direction and said that there just shouldn't be expressions of religious views in the public square. So I don't think the American public square should be naked at all. I think it should be very much pervaded by religion. And that includes by people who hold government office and are giving expression to their own views, and people can see themselves reflected in government and so forth. But that is entirely different than the debate over, well, what's appropriate to put into law, right? Which does seem like another step. So I think there are different kinds of civil religion that occur here. And I think as long as we're dealing with the robust space, I mean, we don't actually have, we talk about the private and the public. Really important, and Tocqueville would appreciate this. We talk about the private and the public as though there's like this private space where you only have like things that happen behind closed doors, and then there's the public where law governs, right? And that's not reality. In a free society, there's a big open civil society where people associate with each other on a voluntary basis. They express themselves. They give expression to their differences from other people in that space. They evangelize each other. They do all kinds of work that can be controversial and can be marked by agreement and cooperation, can also be marked by competition and conflict. And that's what that big open civic space is, civil society, where people get to freely interact with others and associate with others. And that's fine. It's in public, but it's not of the government. So really there's three categories in a free society, I think. I mean, we have government, we have civil society, we have privacy. And I really think you do need, all of those need to be robust spaces in order to have a free country.
I don't know if this clarifies anything, but part of my read on the law in question is mandating that the Ten Commandments must be on the wall of every classroom. That to me is just a different situation than saying you're allowed to put up a religiously significant document that the school finds historically significant. Those seem like different situations to me. And on the civil society side of things, with the variety of expression, it's funny that you brought up the holiday displays as an exercise in hypocrisy. I actually think of them differently. I was laughing with a colleague of mine who described her hometown's City Hall nativity scene, flanked by a menorah, and then the happy holidays from the atheists of Maricopa. It's all out there. And that doesn't seem to hypocrisy to me at all. It seems like a reflection of the community. This is a holiday season that each one of these groups is marking in distinct ways. And I think there could be a real benefit to the City Hall commissioning. I want representatives from the different Christian churches here to write a reflection on what the nativity scene is doing here. I want a reflection from the Jewish community to explain what Hanukkah means, because I bet a lot of people in town don't know what this is. And tell the atheists what does it mean to have a holiday season when you don't have a religious tradition, because there is an explanation to that. And it's worthwhile for that to be represented as well, so that the atheist members of the community don't become just kind of dismissed or not serious moral presence, but instead can account for themselves as well. I think all of that would be a benefit.
I agree. Hypocrisy was a poorly chosen word, but what was I trying to get at? I do think there's a trade-off here, which is interesting to me, and this becomes controversial whenever we engage in civil religion, either in the holiday displays or in legislative prayers. Right, very famous case, Town of Greece versus Galloway. The court upholds legislative prayers. It's a little uncertain, but almost unanimously the court upheld these. And the way that it became unanimous was that the town had this system of sort of any clergy in town could sign up to come give the invocation at the opening to the town council meeting. And you had a bit of a revolving door of different people signed up. The complaint in that particular case, I think, was that it seemed to be Christian ministers that signed up a lot and there weren't very many other people. But it wasn't for lack of opportunity, But I do think it presented, every time we get into one of those kinds of cases, or the holiday display cases, it does present devout believers with a question, and I think a serious question. If the desire is that God be honored in your public spaces, whether that's through the holiday display or whether it's through the invocation at the beginning of a public meeting, at what point does the ecumenicism of those settings You know, if the Wiccan priestess or the local Satanist has to come give an invocation too at some point, it does present devout people with the question, at what point is this not God honoring? And, you know, if my desire was my community honors God and therefore is blessed by God, right? Casting back to, you know, Cyrus or, you know, some of the Persian and Babylonian kings, then I think you do hit a sort of conundrum. That, well, at some point the ecumenicism may become a bit of a joke, I guess, to the extent that devout people think, well, this is just not worth it. I mean, if that's what is necessary, if the dilution of the exercise is essential to continue it, then it might not be worth it, which I think brings us back around kind of to Tocqueville's point. Maybe, maybe religion's more vibrant, more genuine when it's exercised in voluntary associations. It can be more serious because to the extent that you pull it into the public sphere, then it kind of has to be owned by everyone, right? The legislature has to represent everybody. Well, the fact is, you know, Christianity doesn't represent everybody in the community. And then you have to do some version of it. I think you actually see this in Europe, where established churches have had to accommodate, religious services and religious rites that are in direct contradiction to the supposedly established church. Right? You can wind up with some of these situations where, you know, a devout member of the Church of England may be outraged by the fact that now their sacred spaces have to be open to be used by everyone in the community because they're the established church. They belong to the whole community. So you can actually have a kind of dilution and destruction of the integrity of a religious tradition by trying to establish it and make it everybody's. So I think that's something religious believers need to grapple with quite seriously and weigh the costs in terms of pursuing these kinds of public exercises.
You both have presented different positions for us about the role of religion in public schools. How do you think your position helps to benefit American democracy? What do you think the benefit is for American government, given your ideas?
I mean, I think that the more we know about each other, the better we can conduct ourselves in a Republican government. Partly, I alluded to this very briefly, but one of the things I considered as kind of concrete outcomes is the instinct to rule someone out, because I hear they're from a religion I've either never heard of, or I have no positive associations with, or just no content to go along with that name. And this leads me to either not pay attention to or discount someone whose input would actually benefit the community. So that seems to me one kind of easily concrete outcome, that if you demand more knowledge of religion, and here, yeah, I am especially interested in knowledge of history and knowledge of theological claims across world religions that I think just most Americans simply don't have. I think that would help a lot in contextualizing which things are simply unique to my tradition and which are actually pretty genuinely shared across an array of major religious traditions that can open up partnerships and collaboration among citizens, to say nothing of, again, the friendship that I think is really needed for political communities to function well, especially if they're going to deliberate together and think seriously about how to live together.
I don't have much to add to that. It's very compelling the way that Catherine articulates this. I mean, there is I think there's a crucial balance, and maybe this turns out to be a little repetitive, but there's a crucial balance between a pluralistic civil society means both that there is space for people with differences to participate in it, and for us all to share in a kind of civic friendship, see each other as citizens of the same regime and work together, and at the same time maintain the integrity of our own convictions, right? The strength of our own convictions. I think striking that balance is very difficult. It is certainly the case, and we're both. I think the distance between us on this is not great. I know that.
I tried to warn you.
I have, yes, I know. But I do think we have two. Maybe the way to articulate the two alternatives here, in some sense, is that I think that pluralistic society has to have space for, at least at the local level, certainly, for religious communities to express themselves publicly. And that might mean where there's a predominant religious sect, it shows up in the local school curriculum. It is predominant. It does show up more. It would be surprising if a community was not studying its own tradition more than, or giving emphasis to its own traditions more than those outside of itself, even while they should pay due attention to these things. So that suggests that there is space to give pride of place to the community's predominant shared vision. If I lived in a heavily Jewish neighborhood or a community and we were engaged in civic institutions there, I would expect Judaism to work itself out in some very prominent ways, hopefully in ways that didn't exclude the participation of a Christian in that civil society, vice versa. And I do think there's a certain danger to saying, well, as soon as you give any preference or pride of place to something in that tradition, now we have to sort of accompanying it with, a sort of panoply of of the other streams that have contributed, may dilute that somewhat. And maybe it's a matter of place. I like the fact that in the Supreme Court's courtroom, all of this is reflected. On the other hand, I do think there's a space where, the Ten Commandments does occupy a unique place of authority as a source of law, especially for Christians and Jews, also to some extent for the Muslim tradition. And I don't think it's inappropriate to recognize that. Maybe that's a delicate balance to try to maintain. Maybe I'm trying to have my cake and eat it too with that. But that may just be the nature of living in a society full of people who have differences, but are very serious about those differences. They're not just superficial, and we have to take them seriously.
That's the kind of thing I think I at least wish, I think maybe many of us wish that spaces like a legislature could actually just take seriously. Say, hey, this is hard to negotiate. Let's try to do that, taking each other seriously and taking our own tradition seriously. You made the point about taking your own community, like who's present in the community. I should know about them. One of the reasons I've been thinking more about this is because I live in Michigan. So when I would drive to Coldwater to go to Aldi, I would go down the aisles, and on one aisle, I would see a woman, head to toe, burqa, face covering, speaking a language I don't recognize. And I'd realize I don't know what this is. I don't know what's happening here. I have an ignorance of what's happening here. Next aisle, I would see an Amish family, also in this very distinctive mode of dress, also not speaking English and getting their groceries as well. And so I thought, I would be better at living in Michigan if I knew a lot more about both of you, if I knew more about what would make sense to ask this fellow citizen and what would be inconsiderate to ask of this fellow citizen in terms of participation, in terms of what should I know about the days of the week that you observe and the religious customs that affect your public participation. So that's part of what's motivated my thinking on this. And for the sake of maybe getting some conflict between you and me, let's see if we can disagree a little bit more spiritedly. I was thinking about the examples you brought up, this kind of possible dilution if there's Wiccan and Satanist priests or religious figures doing an invocation. It strikes me, and here I'll confess ignorance here. I don't know much about Satanism. My impression is that if we're talking about the organization that's not been around that long, that has some kind of official tax exempt status, I'm not sure. But my impression is that their deal is not religious so much as free thought and kind of freedom from religion, something along those lines. My impression had been that there's not much interest in worshiping Satan, but a lot of interest in shocking Christians and upsetting them. And I think in some ways this is an example of what I'm worried about, because I think if instead of only being angry and rejecting the thought of engaging with a Satanist and saying, like, this is simply scandalous, I'm not going to stand for it, on one hand, that's the Christian reaction, and this kind of delight in provocation from the so-called Satanist, if these people were actually friends and one was able to say, hey, like, I know you, we have children in the sense of, like, our children are living in this space and we want them to be good. We both have a concept of good and a concept of morality. And I'm willing to listen to you, but I need you to understand that when you use this figure, it's that's a lot for my religious tradition to be confronted with. And I think real friendship in that context could actually do a lot of work. But again, it would take real friendship, real knowledge of the other, and really real willingness to listen to what the other person has to say.
I want to thank you both for engaging in discourse about this. It means a lot to model, I think, for students, for our campus, for the public joining us, how you can have real conversation on this topic. So thank you. I'm going to go play my favorite game. I'm going to pretend to be Oprah. I'm from Chicago, so I love this part. So if anyone in the audience has a question, please raise your hand. I will come on over to your way.
With respect to the Ten Commandments, these laws were just for the posting of the Ten Commandments. However, there have been politicians like the former education, not minister, but in Oklahoma, he was like, teach the Ten Commandments. Well, I see that as super problematic because the Ten Commandments, as they're written in most people's Bibles, are not exactly very good law, right? They're very indistinct. What is meant by each of the Ten Commandments is very debatable and is debated hotly. Another thing is that if you don't control the context in which you have delivered the Ten Commandments to an audience, that audience is open to look at it critically. And like you were saying, there are other examples of delivered law, one of which is the Code of Hammurabi. And if you look at the Code of Hammurabi, it looks more like actual functional law than does the Ten Commandments, right? Because the Ten Commandments misses something elementary to law, and that's the penalty clause. It doesn't even offer. It just says, don't do it, right? So the Ten Commandments, when you give it the gravity of original law, it looks like a caricature of law. And there is actually extant law that predates even the Bible's claim of its origin. The Code of Hammurabi predates even the Bible's claim of the origin of the Ten Commandments by 300 years or even more. And it has penalty clauses. It actually looks like a law that you could actually put into practice and there's an actual stone monument in Paris that existed. It was used for that purpose. Whereas in the Ten Commandments, it's a story and it's buried into an Ark of the Covenant, which no law would actually, that would never actually happen to a law, you know, if you were trying to communicate a law. So that's the thing that I think is problematic for the people that want to promote this exposure of the Ten Commandments without them controlling the message that they really want to deliver. It seems more along the lines of maybe misbegotten policy on their part. So anyway, I wondered what your opinions were on that observation.
Well, there's an example in American colonial history of a state really trying to teach the Mosaic Law more broadly. So when we talk about the Mosaic Law, the Ten Commandments constitutes the 20th chapter of Exodus. It's a relatively brief passage. And then it's followed both in quite a few chapters of Exodus and then through essentially the entire text of Leviticus by a codification that carries with it not only the various regulations, but also judicial regulations and penalties and so forth. And I think it's in Connecticut, perhaps Connecticut and Massachusetts in the 17th century. So Puritan, Connecticut, Massachusetts. Children were expected to be instructed in the capital laws. This was required. Parents were directed under penalty to educate their children in the capital laws of the colony. And a distinctive of Puritan New England was that Puritan New England limited capital punishment to only those crimes that were punishable by death in the Old Testament. And that sounds harsh, but compare those couple of dozen capital laws to the hundreds of crimes that were punishable by death in England at the time. So this was a tempering. But what this would have meant was parents were under legal penalty required to have their children memorize the capital laws of the Old Testament, of what remained of the codification in Exodus and then the Levitical Code. So there are examples in American history of a much more extreme effort to actually educate children in the Mosaic Law. And that points up to me that, yeah, the Ten Commandments actually is a much more, exists at a very high level of generality, which might be one of the things, kind of like the Declaration of Independence, you know, it exists at this level of generality that doesn't give you a lot of definiteness, but does give you some basis for consensus because of its level of generality.
And I would add to that, I appreciate your point about the ambiguity of what it could possibly mean to teach the Ten Commandments. And for me, this speaks to the need to, again, this is an ambitious idea, but I think we would be better served if more Americans were aware of the variety of Christian approaches to the Ten Commandments. And I would have to assume the variety of Jewish approaches to the Ten Commandments, and just understand that when you encounter somebody from this or that church, their appreciation of this law is going to look like this, and then somebody from this other tradition is going to have either more options or fewer options. Just, I think all of that would help us understand one another.
I think Catholics and Puritans had quite the disagreement over that graven images business.
Turns out.
Hi, thank you both for coming today. I've really enjoyed it. My question you both touched on a little bit, but didn't quite answer what I was wondering. When we talk about other religions, if we assume that the Constitution allows us to mandate the posting of the Ten Commandments in public schools, where do the laws land when we request that other religious texts are also posted in the schools?
Do you mean according to the current law?
If we're assuming that it is constitutional to mandate it, yes.
Are you asking what would happen if a government mandated other law, like,
Sorry, no, if the government mandates, like Alabama is trying to pass a law saying that we have to post the Ten Commandments in public schools. If they do that, what would happen if they then denied another religious text being posted in schools?
I think that would be a problem.
Oh, I can see. No, let me tell you how this would happen, and it involves your home state. The largest mosque in America is in Dearborn, and we have municipalities that have majority Muslim communities, I believe. So I can very much imagine a situation where a local governing authority said, we're going to display some sort of Muslim religious text. Right, the 5 pillars of Islam we're going to put on the wall. And then the state legislature came in and said, no, here's the approved list of things you can put on the wall in the classroom. That would get pretty sticky, because quite often when the government's telling some person, you can put this up and not that, you can communicate this message and not that one, we usually analyze that under the rubric of viewpoint discrimination. However, the walls or hallways of a school or a courthouse are not the private property of any person. They're not the forum through which any individual expresses themselves. If the state regulates what's in those spaces, we get into the realm of what we call government speech. And this is a quite good question, because a question the court has not answered here and will have to at some point is, what about when the government says you can display these documents and no others? Well, if it's government speech on the government's own property, then typically the government can choose what messages it wants to convey and choose not to convey others. There have been interesting license plate cases where states have refused to let people put lascivious or controversial things on license plates, and people went, but that's my license plate. It said, actually, no, the state owns the license plate. So they can choose to communicate some messages and they can refuse to communicate others. So you can have a choose life license plate and not have a pro-abortion license plate if you want, because the government's saying, we prefer that, not this. And the government does get to choose what it thinks is good or bad, preferable or not. And I do think we are quite likely to run into some circumstances where local communities will want to do some things state legislatures object to, and it'll be a fight between the legislature, that is the statewide political majority, and the local political majority. And I could very much see that. That is a real danger. But I don't know how the court would handle it.
Hey, my name is Nick Schell. I'm a junior here. I'm majoring in political science. My question lies in identity for Americans. A lot of Americans don't really grow up in religion as they used to anymore. And to think about George Washington's farewell address, a part of it he states that religion and morality are indispensable supports for political prosperity. And to see that other nations send people to our nation to evangelize in Islam or other religions, would you say that the basis of our Christian principles being undermined by foreign nations is an issue, and that if the states don't do anything to teach our students on Christianity, that the state would be sort of doing wrong against their people?
I think the empirical case that the vibrancy of religion is dependent on what the government says is pretty weak. Christianity has prospered in the teeth of persecution throughout history. I'm not sure there's a correlation between a favorable government or legal situation and the growth of the faith or the vibrancy of the faith. I think Rodney Stark, sociologist, sort of did some empirical work on this, argued that was not the case. As far as immigration goes, this gets to the nub of an issue. It's quite possible that folks could say, I want America to be, if you believe that Christianity is the truth, of course you want other people to believe it. I mean, it would be irrational to think, what's good for people. Of course Catholics want other people to convert to Catholicism. It wouldn't make any sense if they didn't. On the other, it's quite possible to say, I wish or I hope more Americans will become Christians or will stay in the faith and so forth, and direct your efforts toward that. And at the same time, not feel the compunction to use government coercion to prevent other people from entering the country. I think immigration is a particularly sensitive issue with this. I can understand the reflex, but I also think that folks have to have the confidence to evangelize people back, I guess.
Yeah, I think it is. It's the job of the churches to witness to the faith in such a way that it is attractive and even irresistible if they do their job well enough. And I agree with Dr. Brogdon. That's not the state's job, and that's not a job that the state could do very well, even if they tried to. And as for the idea of kind of foreign nations undermining our own values or morals, this is actually part of why I'm thinking about and writing about this, because I think this is something that Americans are afraid of when they see populations growing that are not Christian. And I think if you're going to be afraid of that, you need to know a lot more. You need to know a lot more about Islam. You need to know a lot more about whatever thing is concerning you. And I think many Americans are ready to jump to conclusions before they know enough to say this actually is undermining anything. I can think of many unchurched, irreligious people in my area whose lifestyles reflect one who has no religious conviction, that in my opinion could be greatly helped actually if they found faith in Islam and began to abandon substance abuse and pornography use and other things because of that. So in some ways, your question reminds me again of the way that Catholics are talked about in the 19th century and described as anti-American and undermining the fabric of the country. And this is part of why I'm interested in the question.
You know, in the founding of our country, for many years, the Bible was used to teach reading in the schools, in the public schools. We tend to forget that. A lot of that went on up till the 1930s. I wonder what your thoughts are if the Ten Commandments had a different, if you didn't call them the Ten Commandments, and you just put these 10 items on a paper and put it in a school, what harm is it going to do the children to see, hey, this is a reminder, don't kill somebody. You know, that's already in law. Don't steal things. Treat your neighbor well, like you want to be treated. What is the awful harm that it's going to do to our children to be reminded of these good principles?
Well, I don't think it's going to do them any harm because I think they're true. But I think the point is that a lot of Americans don't think all of those things are true. So it's opening, I'm the Lord thy God. We omit the part about who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. So it does have a lot of what we would call fundamental morality that, because it's true, is common to people, reasonable people who reflect on what's good for human beings. And then it has provisions. Aquinas drew this line, right? I mean, Aquinas said nobody would discern by nature the requirement of the Sabbath. But it's in the Ten Commandments. So Aquinas said that's a place where the law, is giving a pure divine command that you couldn't just figure out by reason. It's something God wants you to do that you wouldn't know by nature. But many of those other things are things that folks would figure out. Now, is it harmful for them to study it? No, I mean, I don't think so at all. I would also point out, I think it is the case that students do, at least if they're getting a good education, are encountering a lot of Christian literature and things that are far more theological than the Ten Commandments themselves. My students, whenever I teach jurisprudence, read a huge chunk of Aquinas' Summa Theologiae. massive chunks of other Christian theologians. I have students read Roger Williams and John Winthrop and John Cotton. And they read other people too. So in the midst of an education, I think encountering ideas, certainly some person could be, overwhelmed by and sort of steeping themselves in some sort of horrible, obscene ideas. If they didn't read anything else, I don't think encountering ideas or texts is ever going to harm a child, assuming it's age appropriate. So I'm not sure it's a question of harm. I think it's the concern of people who don't want to see it posted is that it signals to people outside the Christian and Jewish traditions that they're not full members of the political community. That's the argument that members of the court have made. I don't think that's a problem. Because I do think our law and our traditions are fundamentally, in a very important way, a Christian tradition. Doesn't mean everybody's a Christian in America, but it does mean I think our system of laws and our system of government did grow out of a Christian tradition. Interestingly, a competition between competing Christian sects, sort of internecine conflict between Christians, forced us all to sort of live up to a set of principles of liberty, I think, that nonetheless were generated by Christianity, or at least became instantiated in the context of Christianity. So I guess the answer, I don't really have a problem with that, but I can see where folks are concerned about the exclusion of people in the political community, the feeling of exclusion people would have.
So I think this slight disagreement that we have is that it makes sense to me that if the Ten Commandments are posted in such a way in a school building that it communicates a exclusive kind of role that this Judeo-Christian tradition holds. I think that does affect the non-Christian children that attend that school. And I think it also has the potential, that doesn't have to play out this way, to affect the kinds of relationships that all of the children at the school have with each other. And so you asked, what harm does it do? This is why my instinct is to just put more stuff on the wall. I want more information. I want more history and more religion. And I think about the end of C.S. Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man, where he has that section that he calls the Tao, but he just compiles moral injunctions from around the world. As you said, what's wrong with a child seeing, don't kill, don't lie, don't steal. Well, he draws these moral injunctions from around the world and from different religious traditions in order to show the seriousness of this, that this is human reflection on life. This is the kind of moral order it generates, and this does seem to be universal. And I think the help that this gives to an American public school is to, I think it just makes us wiser, to be better educated, to know more about the moral and theological traditions of the world. And I think it makes us better citizens, better friends, and better suited to deliberate on these questions, would be my take.
First of all, thank you for the conversation. I think open conversation is always healthy. It's good, whether we agree or disagree. I want to go back to a couple of things, and a couple of things been mentioned, of course, about George Washington's farewell address and him stating that religion, morality were indispensable supports of our nation. We look at the Mayflower Compact. We look at the reasoning for the people who came to this country originally, and they came with these ideals that the Christian and morality were indispensable reasons for coming and were things that were absolutely necessary. One of the things, in posting the Ten Commandments and those kind of things, and until about 60 or 70 years ago, we really didn't have a lot of these conversations. It was in 1947 that the Supreme Court used that first phrase, separation of church and state. Here we go down this slippery slope of thinking that these things have to be separated. Up until then, they never were. They were always part of of what we knew as our foundational belief as of what created our nation. Matter of fact, I do believe it's those foundational Christian principles that have really allowed other people to be able to come to this nation and live freely, or at least that's the way it should be. I've been privileged to be in other countries, to be in Southeast Asia and other places where if you go there as a Christian, you don't have that freedom. You have to adhere to what's there or keep yourself quiet. So I think it's our moral and religious foundation that's really given other people the ability to come and live in this free country as we know it today. But this is a question. You know, every society has a fabric, and I believe those Christian and principles of our nation were the fabric that formed us, because we're celebrating our 250th anniversary just here in a few months. If those traditions and if those values erode, will our freedom that we so love and so others that don't even adhere to our principles love, will they erode as well? That's my question.
Yeah, if our commitment to basic morality erodes, we're in serious trouble as a civil society. And I take quite seriously Washington's admonition there. I guess I'd reiterate, I don't feel passionate about the Ten Commandments issue, in part because I feel like there's little that government itself can actually do to cultivate religious faith or vibrancy. I do want, when a community does have a vibrant faith and commitment to those principles, I think it's perfectly appropriate to express them in public ways and in ways that don't coerce people, including by displaying them. I do think that when our commitment, if vibrant faith in a community, Christian faith, erodes in a community or decays, you can also have a situation where, you know, sort of the cut flower continues to bloom for a while. And you can be exhausting the capital that was built up by previous generations. And in those cases, I'm quite sympathetic to the Christian thinkers who say, better to face up to the fact that people have abandoned the faith and set about the work of prophetic witness and evangelization, and abandon the idea that the government can save people and do the prophetic work of the church instead. I don't know if that's where we are. And, you know, at this point, I'll confess I'm speaking quite personally as a Christian in this case, not as, you know, in a scholarly sense. But I do think that's something that believers in our community need to wrestle with. If it is the case that Christianity's hold on our civil society and it's the hold of the Christian faith on people in our communities has slipped, and those communities are not essentially Christian at this point, we may be fooling ourselves by making public displays that pretend as though we're still a Christian society, when in fact, we may be quite otherwise, and people may need to know that, because they may need to know how desperately they're actually in need of saving. I think that's a serious thing for Christians to wrestle with in this environment. I certainly know it's something that European Christians have needed to wrestle with quite seriously, because those vestiges of religious establishments are, in many cases, just nominal. They're meaningless. Someone like Solzhenitsyn, or someone like a Kierkegaard, or I think Solzhenitsyn, some of these thinkers, you know, some Christian thinkers would say, better to discard it and start over than to try to hang on to it for the last grasp. So just perhaps a provocative thought.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to me. I know that in my own very small town and in my own parish, one of the projects that we are grappling with is to think very carefully about our presence in the town. So why is Hillsdale different for having this church in it? And can the town feel the presence of the church? Is the work that we do helping people, sustaining them, and bringing Christ to them through that work? And I think I'm just in agreement with Dr. Brogdon on this, that this is a question every church needs to face and take seriously. A church is not just a place that you go to spend some time on Sunday and see some friends. This is a body that witnesses to the faith, and whether or not the faith is plausible to people, whether or not it's attractive to people, has everything to do with the Christians that they've seen, and that's a problem for any Christian, like myself and Dr. Brogdon included.
Well, thanks for coming to campus. Pleasure. I think that, let me just ask this. I think that respect, if we took it as a matter of respect, I think we would all be better off. In that, if you put your commandments up, and I don't believe in those commandments, it's disrespectful to me. If I put a upside down pentagram in my classroom, and I will not do this, Steve. If I put an upside down pentagram in my classroom, it's certainly disrespectful to all those Christians. So my question is, what's wrong with respecting by leaving everything out?
I think the cost of ignorance is too high. That would be my answer. I think that I agree completely with you that respect is a frequently missing ingredient in these conversations. There's a costly lack of empathy that we see in these conversations where people on either side of an issue are not willing to imagine, what does this mean to you? Why would you react this way? Why is this a difficult question to talk about? I think these are all essential ingredients to civil discourse, to friendship, and to a functional republic. But to say, this kind of goes back to the wall of separation. Well, what if we clear everything out? And I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to hear about the fact that human beings, for the majority of recorded history, have been religious people. And I don't want to hear about the fact that they have worshipped divinity in these varieties of ways. I think the reason that doesn't quite work is that the religious traditions of various peoples have persisted. They are parts of our communities. So what I would add also that I should have made clearer in my remarks, I think the moral tradition of secularism should also be part of this education. So we've talked about the religious freedom, and where does this come from? And I've mentioned the kind of the chaos and the turbulence after the Reformation, and the really vicious behavior of Christians to each other in the name of their faith. Part of that story is Christians grappling with that reality and looking at each other. I think of Rafe Cudworth in England in the 17th century saying, what kind of church is this? We were meant to be a church of peace. Have you seen this country? It's deeply moving, but also part of that story are serious atheist voices saying, this is why I don't want to be Christian, because I don't want to live like this. So I think all of those stories need to be present. I think there should be real, honest history where everyone tells the truth about how these things came to be, and why it is that, in my case, I still am a devout Catholic, and that's not going to change. But it doesn't trouble me at all to look at that full story and say, yes, my children need to know this.
I mean, there is a kind of reciprocation. I think you're expressing a concern that's a serious one, which is if we can put the Ten Commandments on the wall in Alabama, are we okay when some other state puts a thing on the wall that's really objectionable? I mean, plenty of classrooms in the country with pride flags plastered around the classroom or what have you. And people get quite incensed about that sort of thing. And they think, well, okay, I understand most of the people in my community think that, but my family doesn't think that, and it's hard to be in this classroom with, the teacher or the state has all of these messages posted around the room that antagonize my family's religious tradition or our moral convictions. I'm not sure we can escape that. I mean, I don't know if we can empty our public spaces of expressions of our convictions. At some level, human beings do tell their own story and express their convictions. And it is part and parcel of a community that you give expression to that and you display it. You can try to navigate it, and I think this was part of the First Amendment tradition of saying, states are having to come up with very delicate settlements of how to deal with these sorts of situations and deal with them in a way that respects each other. What I don't think there is any kind of escape from the problem. So we'll face it one way or the other in some ways. Does that mean that sticking the Ten Commandments on the wall is the solution? I don't know. We got more hands up there, but we are. I think Ben has brought out the shepherd's crook to pull us off the stage.
You won't believe it. We've been here for 2 hours. And yeah, I know. And so I want to thank you all because I know there's more questions. And we started this by saying the goal of this initiative is to get us to think, to listen, to reflect, and to have conversation. That doesn't mean we answer every question today. And so I hope we all will continue to have conversation with each other. And I want to thank you both for leading us in that conversation and for coming here today. So thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
And thank you, Alabama, for being such a hospitable place.